What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend to debrief and effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm your host for this week's episode. Joining me in the booth, we've never had this combination before. I'll come your way first and introduce you to these people. Hard to believe some of them might not know who you are, but it's possible. This is your first time here, Brian Weir. Brian, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Thanks
You
for
for
having
being
me.
here.
Yeah,
Absolutely. I know you
pleasure.
have no clue what you're getting into,
I do
but I
not.
love it. You're willing. He's back with us. You have been on this podcast before, believe it or not.
Yeah,
You've been on. I think you've probably been on each of the podcasts.
maybe.
There is no podcast without Mike Thomas. That's what they say in my home. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, good to be here.
Appreciate it. So we don't have Mark Carey here, so we're not going to solve all the problems.
Oh, so we can all get up and go.
Yeah, right. So we're done. Thanks for listening. But I did want to jump into a Sunday in review. At the end of the podcast, we'll talk a little bit about what's to come with Follow the Star and the rest of our Christology series. But Brian, I'll come your way first, just kind of impressions on the weekend. Mark unpacked for us this idea of a suffering God, a God who suffered. So as you were engaging with the service this weekend, anything in particular stand out to you or was impactful?
Yeah, it was that reminder that I don't suffer well. You know, I mean, I may not pout like Mark did about not getting enough turkey at Thanksgiving or whatever, but, you know, there are times in my life where I'll admit I do not suffer well. And I think it's always a good reminder that, you know, suffering is it's God's grace, you know, and how we respond to that suffering is a way to honor him. And yeah, that's always good to be reminded of that.
Yeah, I feel like it's not a fun thing to teach through, preach through, but when you think about Christology and all that must entail, it's cool to be able to do that, and it's obviously setting us up well for the Christmas season and then into Easter and everything that's happened. But Mike, I want to come your way first off this weekend, anything that stood out to you, and then second, since we have you here, the Christology series as a whole, what has God been teaching you through that? What has had an impact recently?
Yeah, well, this weekend in particular, the idea of the Christ having to suffer. As the elders got up and did communion, the idea of must suffer these things. And that very point has been one that has been on my heart lately because starting January 5th, three of us are going to be teaching a series from the Emmaus Road encounter with the two disciples that Jesus had. And he asks them this question, ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and enter his glory? You know? So there it is right there. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things? And the question, why? Why did Jesus have to suffer? So very, very appropriate, very good. And Mark touched on most of it, but there's so much there to unpack. And the impact that it has on the rest of our lives and how we think daily and why we think, yeah, this is important. That one phrase that he used, this is grace given to you to suffer. And it's like, huh? You know, that just doesn't seem right. But yet, the more we understand why Jesus had to suffer, then we begin to understand why we are to suffer as well. And it's actually a good thing. It's a grace.
It's good.
I like at the end with the application when he talked about how we had to have the right focus, the right attitude, the right perspective, and then obviously following his example. So I thought that was really applicable with how we respond to things in our life and how we should suffer.
Yeah, I think the temptation is to do everything right, things are going well, focus on God and all the good stuff. But what about when it is hard? How to suffer well? I think a theology of suffering's pretty important. I think that could be a huge reason people walk away from the Lord, or maybe stop going to church, or stop taking a lot of this faith walk seriously. But then when you look in I appreciate the depth of the Christology series, because you start to study the Word, then you realize, wait a second, it's not all sunshine and rainbows for believers. If you actually stop your Bible study at that layer, you're like, I don't want to sign up for this at all. Right. What Christ is calling me to do. And I appreciate some of the things Mark was pulling out in that regard. But one thing that specifically stood out to me was this idea of patiently enduring that was popping up in the Peter passages. And just almost the reliance on God's timing instead of our own in that. And he used that vivid analogy of the walls and the ceiling closing in and almost just bracing yourself. But having a theological foundation for that, I think is really important. And it makes me want to ask you, Brian, like you work with children, I work with teens. This is something worth instilling in them without scaring them. It's something that all of our families should be aware of. how to suffer well. Well, I don't know, in your experience working with children or raising daughters, like are you sitting in a sermon learning this stuff going like, I don't even know how to do this well. I can't imagine where they're at.
Yeah.
Or it's
Yeah,
daunting.
it is. I mean, because as teenage girls, every day they're dealing with the trials of whatever that looks like in their day, right?
High school, man. It's
right?
hard. Yeah.
High school drama,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so, it's easy sometimes to say, I'll deal with it, suck it up, move on kind of thing. But that in their world, it's their suffering, and so we have to step back, get the right focus, like Mark said, have the right attitude, the right perspective, and follow his example. And there's plenty of opportunities to do that with teens, kids, ourselves included.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think of all these teens that are, I've been on staff here long enough now to where some of them have graduated or started families. They're part of the congregation, not that they weren't, but they're becoming members or continuing to attend here, planting roots here. So anytime I am sitting under a teaching like this, I just find myself going like, okay, this is helpful for all of us, regardless of our age, to understand, because then we can defend ourselves against some of the lies that can pop up from that, or we can really grow in our appreciation again of Christ and a hyper awareness of what he exactly went through. And that's something that this week we covered. We'll cover it next week as well as we lean into the Christmas season. But I find myself, I mean, you alluded to this, Brian, I don't suffer well. Yeah. I'm learning new things about the Christmas season and Jesus and everything he went through, everything he felt, the things he said. And that's so eye-opening to me. That I can, I don't know, be in ministry or be a believer this long or whatever you might want to say. We all come up with reasons to cool off in our study of getting to know Jesus more. But I think that's why we're doing this, right, Mike? Like this Christology series, let's study him. That's going to tie into the end of the season.
It does. And every step along the way in the series, we've learned something new specifically about who the Christ is. And, his... what's that big word? Where both natures fully exist.
Hypostatic union.
Hypostatic union. And one of the points that Mark brought out this Sunday was that he was eternal past. Jesus, or not Jesus, but the Christ has always been the Son of God. He was not created. And so that term of being firstborn really had to do with his responsibilities and the things that belong to him rather than an order of being the firstborn in that sense. Being firstborn, he was always existent, so he was not created. But being firstborn of creation has more to do with his position, because having been pre-existent, he now entered creation. He how did Mark say it? Created by him, for him, through him. All that was done through the Christ, through the Son of God. And then he entered into it, and he became the firstborn. He became the highest rank, the highest of all of creation. And that's that misunderstanding that the Arians didn't quite get, and present-day folks who think that Christ had to be created because of that term. That's not what he's referring to. So for the Christ to have been pre-existent, for God the Father and God the Son to make this covenant, which requires, as we saw during the weekend, a death to take place. In order for the Christ to become that preeminent, first of all creation, firstborn from the dead, he had to die. He had to die. Yeah. Even before sin entered the world. That was the plan. And if it didn't take place, we would not experience the fullness that God has intended from us since before time began.
And I think that's so much deeper than what the common Christian thinks today, especially when you think of Christ in Christmas time, born in a manger as a baby. And most Christians, I would say, would probably think, oh, Jesus was born. He was born in a manger, right? They don't think of the preeminence, the preexistence, and all that kind of stuff. So it's really been good to get that perspective. I mean, even in children's ministry, I know it's hard for children to understand, the difference between Jesus and God, and we talk about how Jesus was God, but yet there's God the Father, and that
Yeah.
kind of gets confusing even for adults, right? And so I think it's been good just through this whole study to just kind of understand who Jesus is, who he was, and who he still is today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's good. Well, not to put you on the spot, Mike, but as the elders meet and talk about the Christology series, the impact that a focus on communion has had, all the different elements of Christ, like, has that been an encouraging time? Have the elders enjoyed and had conversations with people about, okay, this is fruitful and growing, and people are really growing in their understanding of Christ, believers? What has that, I feel led to get the inside scoop because I have an elder on the podcast, but
So it's not like we sit around and compare notes of,
Sure.
well, who have you talked to, but those stories percolate up, and yeah, it's definitely been interesting through this whole series how different things have impacted different people, and we share, that does get discussed or talked about at elder meetings, but more out of just relating stories rather than all right, next on the agenda.
right.
But one particular, the immaculate, no, one characteristic of Christ, that he was not able to sin.
Impeccability.
Impeccability. Thank you. It's nice to have a team here. That one really caused some. Well, wait a minute. You mean he couldn't sin?
What do you mean God couldn't do something, right?
Right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that and the impact. Well, Jesus couldn't have sinned. Well, was that really a viable test? Because he was tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. And yet God himself, God the Father, God cannot be tempted, and yet Jesus was. So he knows. He knows what it's like for us to be tempted, but he did it without sin. So the point of whether or not he could or couldn't sort of becomes moot, but it sure stirred up some interesting
Yeah,
conversation.
I'm sure it does. Well, I think that's the beauty of it. I think that's what any sermon series should do, is stir up conversation.
Yes.
Get to a point where the sermon ends and you're like, okay, God is so great, I can respond in worship. But that is something worth pondering. That is something worth studying. That's something worth applying in my own life and applying into the life of anybody I might lead or have influence over. So I think I've been very encouraged by it. I've had a lot of good conversations with people about it. And so as it, again, just fits so well into whatever might be going on and into the holiday season, the Christmas season, it's just really cool to see that come together.
Yeah.
So anyway, any final thoughts, words of wisdom before I transition?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to the first passage, or the first sermon, I should say, about who do you say I am? And the one thing that I really liked was his reference to, Jesus is either a liar, he's a lunatic, or he's the Lord.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's a very applicable conversation that we can have with people outside of this church when people say, well, Jesus wasn't God, Jesus was just a man or whatever. And well, he's either one of those three things, right? You can't believe half of what he said, right? You either believe everything he said or you don't believe anything he said. And I think that was a good truth. And, we could go through each one of these sermons and took notes of things that stood out to me, but that was one just overall, I think, is just starting that conversation with people, that Jesus was God, that he was who he said he was.
I think that's the beauty of the conversation. Bring them face to face with whatever they believe about him.
Right.
Start the conversation. Right. Have them have to wrestle with it, right? I think of it sometimes as give them a chance to reject the gospel. Because then you're giving them a chance, or you're sharing the gospel, and they're face to face with truth. What they do with it, what the Spirit does with it, and whether or not their hearts are open. We don't have the lens for that, and we don't have the ability in and of ourselves to save anybody.
I think another item that stood out to me was the future work, the judgment. We broke down those three judgments, the great white throne judgment, the bema seat judgment, and then even the sheep and goats, threw that in there. And so I think that was good, just to allow everyone to understand what those three judgments were. So that was
well, and he brought up the future again as well in terms of Christ's suffering, that Revelation 5 passage of exalting Christ. And so it's this beautiful reminder that it's all going to come not just full circle, but to completion in a way that benefits the body and glorifies God. It's just what a beautiful thing to not just be reminded of, but to really cling to as we move forward. You got your finger in a passage. Mike, I can tell you're ready to rock. Let's go.
So with the apprenticeships this year, we are continuing to study Book of Colossians, and right there in chapter 1, it talks very much about these very things, the preeminence of Christ, which Mark brought into a sermon, but it's bringing that through every one of these series, or in the series. And it says that he's the firstborn from the dead. And what came to mind, because I just had this conversation with a woman who's joining the church today. We just had a new member interview today. And the idea, when Lazarus died, and Jesus has allowed him to die, Martha came out to meet him as he finally arrived on the scene. He said, "You could have saved my brother. You could have kept him from dying. You could have healed him." And Jesus says, "Well, you know he's going to rise in the resurrection." And she says, "Yes, I know he will do that." And he turns to her and says, "I am the resurrection." It's not just that I'm going to die and rise again from the dead, but I am the resurrection. None of this resurrection stuff takes place but through me. And to realize that, that just exalts him that much more. He's the preeminence not only of all creation. He created everything, but now he's also the resurrection. Nobody rises again from the dead apart from Jesus.
Good.
And he's there. What a hope we have.
It's awesome. It's not just about something he offers. It's about him. And that's ultimately what he offered, which is great. And that's one thing I do want to point people towards before we get out of here. Follow the Stars this weekend. Things are busy and we're excited for that. But Saturday and Sunday night, December 7th and 8th, 5 to 8 p.m. Right here on campus, Middle Road. So please come, invite your neighbors and friends, and serve if you have yet to get plugged in for that. It's going to be exciting. I'm on parking lot duty. It's going to be freezing. Can't wait.
Layer up.
I got to buy some hand warmers, I guess, or something. But yeah, should be a good time. So, Brian, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will never look at cornflakes the same.
Oh, from the sermon last time. There you go.
I
Yeah, might have ruined a cereal for you, but
okay.
Mike,
all good.
You're the man. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
As a reminder to all of you viewers and listeners, we love to hear from you. You can find us at fbcva.org/podcast, and be sure to check out our other 2 podcasts as well, The Fellowship Family and Global Church. The fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to just take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.